I never imagined that the proudest day of my life would also become the day I finally realized I didn't have a family anymore. I invited my parents and my siblings to the biggest award ceremony of my career because despite everything, I still wanted them there. Instead of congratulating me, my father laughed right in my face and said, "Who hands out awards to lowly teachers? Let me know when you win something that actually matters." Everyone around us went silent. I stood there in my dress, holding the invitation I'd been so excited to send him, wondering if I was being too sensitive or if this was finally the moment I should stop trying to earn love that was never freely given. So tell me, if you were in my shoes, would you have still saved seats for your family after hearing those words, or would you have walked away for good? Growing up, I was the invisible daughter. My name is Emma, I'm 34 years old, and I've been a public school teacher for almost 12 years. My younger brother Ryan was the golden child because he played football. My older sister Claire became a corporate lawyer, which my parents never stopped bragging about. Meanwhile, I loved books, children, and education. According to my father, that meant I had no ambition. Every family gathering somehow turned into a speech about how teachers wasted their intelligence because the money was terrible. My mother never defended me. She usually smiled awkwardly and changed the subject while my father kept going. The worst part wasn't even the insults, it was how normal they became. After years of hearing them, I almost started believing I deserved them. When I graduated from college with honors, my parents skipped the ceremony because Ryan had a baseball tournament. When I landed my first teaching job, Dad asked when I planned on finding a real career. When one of my students won a statewide science competition after months of extra tutoring, I proudly shared the article with my family. Dad barely glanced at it before saying, "Imagine what you could accomplish if you worked somewhere important." I smiled through the pain because that's what I always did. Teaching wasn't easy. There were days when I bought school supplies with my own paycheck because my students couldn't afford notebooks. I stayed late helping struggling kids prepare for exams. I visited hospitals when students got sick. I attended graduations years after they left my classroom because they invited me. Every handwritten thank you note I received meant more than any paycheck ever could. Still, every holiday dinner reminded me that my own family considered my career embarrassing. Then I met Daniel. He wasn't rich, famous, or flashy. He was a pediatric physical therapist who understood what it meant to dedicate your life to helping others. On our third date, he asked me about my students, and he listened for nearly 2 hours without checking his phone once. That was the first time someone made me feel like my work mattered. When Daniel met my parents, my father immediately asked him how much money he made. Daniel politely answered before adding that he admired teachers because they shaped every profession in society. Dad rolled his eyes and changed the subject. On the drive home, I apologized for my father's behavior. Daniel squeezed my hand and simply said, "Emma, your job changes lives. Whether they see it or not doesn't change the truth." Those words stayed with me. Over the next several years, I poured everything into teaching. I started mentoring new teachers. I organized literacy programs. I created after-school tutoring sessions. I worked weekends planning lessons that made learning exciting. It wasn't glamorous, but I loved every exhausting minute. One spring afternoon, my principal called me into her office. I assumed I'd forgotten to submit paperwork. Instead, she smiled so widely that I knew something unusual was happening. "Emma," she said, "you've been nominated for the State Excellence in Education Award." I laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. Former students had written letters. Parents had submitted recommendations. Fellow teachers, administrators, and community leaders all contributed testimonials about my work. I spent the next hour crying in her office because I had no idea so many people noticed the little things I'd done over the years. Months later, I learned I'd made it to the final 3 nominees. Daniel cried harder than I did. When the official invitation arrived, it included reserved seating for family members. I stared at those extra tickets for almost an hour. Maybe this would finally be different. Maybe if my parents saw an entire auditorium honoring teachers, they'd finally understand. I personally delivered the invitation. My mother smiled politely. Claire glanced at it and said she'd check her schedule. Ryan barely looked up from his phone. Dad laughed. Actually laughed. Then came the sentence that still echoes in my mind. "Who hands out awards to lowly teachers?" I felt every ounce of excitement drain from my body. He continued before I could answer. They're probably giving everyone a participation trophy these days. Nobody said anything. Not my mother. Not my siblings. Just silence. I quietly folded the invitation back into its envelope and said I hoped they'd still come. Dad shrugged. We'll see if something more important doesn't come up. I drove home fighting tears the entire way. Daniel found me sitting in the driveway 20 minutes later because I couldn't bring myself to go inside. He didn't ask what happened. He already knew. The ceremony arrived 2 weeks later. I kept checking my phone, hoping someone would text that they were on their way. Nothing. Daniel, my best friend Sophia, my principal, and several co-workers sat beside the empty seats I'd reserved for my family. Every empty chair felt like another rejection. Then the ceremony began. Teachers from all over the state were recognized for incredible achievements. Some had worked through natural disasters. Some had created programs for children with disabilities. Some had transformed struggling schools into thriving communities. Listening to their stories reminded me why I loved this profession. When they announced the winner, I honestly expected another name. Instead, I heard mine. For a second, I couldn't move. Daniel practically pushed me out of my chair. As I walked across the stage, the audience stood. Hundreds of educators applauded. Parents applauded. Students applauded. Former students applauded. The standing ovation lasted longer than my acceptance speech. I looked toward the empty seats reserved for my family one last time before stepping to the microphone. I thanked my students for teaching me resilience. I thanked my colleagues for reminding me that kindness changes lives. I thanked Daniel for believing in me when I struggled to believe in myself. I never mentioned my parents. Not once. Halfway through this story, I honestly want to ask you something. What would you have done? Would you have kept chasing your family's approval after years of being treated like you were never enough, or would you have stopped trying? Before I tell you what happened next, think about it for a second and leave your answer in the comments because, at the time, I truly didn't know if I was about to make the right decision. The next morning, my acceptance speech went viral online. A former student had uploaded it. Within 48 hours, local news stations picked it up. Parents shared it. Teachers across the country commented. Thousands of people thanked me for speaking about educators with respect and compassion. Suddenly my phone exploded. Not with congratulations from strangers. From my family. Dad called 6 times. Mom texted that they wanted to celebrate. Claire sent a message saying she always knew I'd accomplish something great. Ryan asked if I could get him tickets to another ceremony because his co-workers had seen the video. It felt surreal. The same people who mocked my profession suddenly wanted to be associated with it because the internet had decided my achievement mattered. I ignored the messages for 2 days. Finally, my mother convinced me to meet them for dinner. When I arrived, everyone acted as if nothing had happened. Dad smiled. Actually smiled. He started introducing me to people in the restaurant as our award-winning daughter. I stared at him in disbelief. When everyone sat down, I calmly asked one question. Where were you during the ceremony? Silence. Dad cleared his throat. We got busy. You laughed at me. It was just a joke. It wasn't. Mom tried changing the subject. Claire said I was holding onto negativity. Ryan suggested everyone move on. For the first time in my life, I didn't let them rewrite history. I reminded them about every graduation they skipped. Every insult. Every sarcastic comment. Every moment they made me feel ashamed for loving my career. Dad became defensive. We pushed you because we wanted better for you. No, I answered. You pushed me because you only respected success that looked the way you imagined. Nobody argued. Because they couldn't. Then Dad asked if I'd be willing to speak at a charity event one of his business partners was organizing. Apparently, having an award-winning teacher in the family suddenly had value. I smiled politely. No. He looked shocked. You don't want to help your family. I wanted my family to help me. I wanted you to sit in those seats. I wanted one night where you were proud of me before strangers told you to be. The table went completely silent. I stood up. Before leaving, I placed my award invitation in front of my father. The same invitation he laughed at weeks earlier. You asked who gives awards to teachers, I said quietly. People whose lives teachers change. Then I walked away. That dinner became the last family gathering I attended. Over the following year, I stopped chasing relationships that only existed when I was useful or successful. Daniel and I got married in a small ceremony surrounded by friends, fellow teachers, former students, and people who had consistently shown up for us. Many of my students attended years later with their own children. Some became teachers themselves. One became a doctor and hugged me while saying I'd inspired her to never give up after failing her first chemistry exam. Another became an engineer and admitted he almost dropped out until I convinced him he was smarter than he believed. Those moments meant more than any trophy sitting on my bookshelf. Ironically, after the award, my school received additional funding through community partnerships inspired by the publicity. We expanded our literacy program, created scholarships, and helped hundreds more children. The recognition wasn't about me anymore. It became an opportunity to help even more students, and that made every difficult year worthwhile. As for my parents, we eventually reached a place of polite distance. They apologized years later, but apologies don't erase decades of emotional wounds. I forgave them because carrying bitterness forever only hurts the person carrying it. Forgiveness, however, didn't mean returning to the same unhealthy relationship. It simply meant I chose peace over resentment. Looking back now, I realize something that would have changed my life if I'd learned it sooner. Never measure your worth by the people who refuse to see it. Sometimes strangers will appreciate your heart long before your own family ever does, and that's okay. The people who truly love you won't wait for an award, a viral speech, or public recognition before deciding you're enough. If you were on my side after hearing everything that happened, I'd really appreciate you hitting that like button because it helps this story reach more people who might need to hear it. Subscribe for more emotional stories like this, and don't forget to share your final thoughts in the comments. Was I right to walk away from my family after years of disrespect, or would you have given them another chance? I'd genuinely love to know what you think. Thank you so much for listening to my story, and I'll see you all in the next one.